When World War II erupted across the Pacific, one aircraft dominated the skies like no other: the Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0. Sleek, light, and incredibly agile, it became the symbol of Japan's aerial supremacy. To American pilots flying outdated machines, it felt almost untouchable, like a predator in the clouds. This was the age of the Zero, a time when Japan ruled the skies, and the world was forced to take notice. The Zero entered service in 1940, designed by Jiro Horikoshi. It weighed far less than most American fighters and had unmatched maneuverability. It could outturn, outclimb, and outrange nearly every aircraft it encountered. With a top speed of around 565 kilometers per hour and a flight range of over 3,000 kilometers, it could strike targets from vast distances, then return to base without refueling. At that time, no American fighter could match that. On December 7, 1941, the world saw the Zero in action during the attack on Pearl Harbor. While American naval ships burned and sank, Zero fighters patrolled the skies overhead, shooting down fleeing aircraft and protecting Japanese bombers with deadly precision. For many American pilots, this was their first encounter with the Zero, and it left them stunned. Reports described its incredible agility, as if it could twist in midair and simply disappear from gun sights. In the months that followed, Japan pushed across the Pacific. From the Philippines to Malaya, from the Dutch East Indies to Singapore, the Zero spearheaded every assault. American and Allied pilots flying P-40 Warhawks, Brewster Buffaloes, or early Wildcats found themselves outclassed. Dogfights often lasted only seconds. Allied pilots said that trying to chase a Zero was like trying to catch a ghost. One U.S. Marine pilot wrote in his diary, "It climbs faster than anything I've ever seen, turns like it has no weight at all. If you get into a turning fight with it, you're dead." What made the Zero so effective was also what made it dangerous for both sides. To maximize speed and agility, it was built with almost no armor. It had no self-sealing fuel tanks. One well-placed bullet could set it ablaze. But as long as Japanese pilots remained highly trained, their skill and the Zero's design combined to form a near-perfect weapon. By early 1942, Japan appeared unstoppable. In the skies over the Coral Sea, the Solomon Islands, and Java, the Zero continued to dominate. In the Battle of the Philippines, a young pilot named Saburo Sakai shot down several American aircraft in a single engagement. He became one of Japan's most famous aces, feared for his precision and calmness under fire. To the Allies, pilots like Sakai felt more like legends than men. American intelligence grew desperate to understand the Zero. Rumors spread. Some said it had an engine stolen from Germany. Others claimed it used secret alloys unknown to the West. Pilots were told to avoid dogfights at all costs. "Never turn with a Zero," commanders warned. "Dive away, use speed, and pray your engine holds." But something was beginning to change. In June 1942, during the Battle of Midway, American forces managed to shoot down several Zeros. For the first time, cracks appeared in Japan's invincible image. Pilots noticed the Zero struggled to dive at high speed. Its unarmored cockpit meant one bullet could kill the pilot. These weaknesses were small, but they were signs that the tide could eventually turn. Still, in 1942, the Zero ruled the sky. If an American pilot heard the chilling words, "Bandits at 12 o'clock, Zeros," his blood ran cold. The Zero was not just an airplane, it was a psychological weapon. Its very presence broke morale. The U.S. needed something new, a fighter that could match the Zero's agility, but survive its bullets. A plane that could turn fear into confidence. Engineers at Grumman Aircraft Corporation began working day and night. They studied wrecked Zero parts from crash sites. They interviewed surviving pilots. They knew this was not just about aircraft, it was about the future of the Pacific War. Thus, as Japan celebrated its dominance, a silent answer was being forged in American factories. A machine designed not only to fight the Zero, but to crush it. And that machine was the F6F Hellcat. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, one thing became painfully clear to the United States Navy and Marine Corps. America's fighter planes were no match for the Japanese Zero. Pilots were brave, but bravery alone couldn't win aerial battles. Their P-40 Warhawks, F-2A Buffaloes, and early Wildcats were slower, less agile, and poorly equipped against the Zero's deadly maneuverability. The United States needed a new fighter, fast. The responsibility for creating this fighter fell to Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, a company in Long Island, New York. Led by aircraft designer Leroy Grumman and engineers like William Schwendler, they were already working on an upgrade to the F4F Wildcat. But after Pearl Harbor, everything changed. The U.S. Navy demanded something far more powerful, an aircraft that could outrun, outgun, and outclimb the Zero. In early 1942, American intelligence recovered a mostly intact Zero that had crashed on Akutan Island in Alaska. This was a turning point. Engineers studied every inch of it, the lightweight frame, the thin wings, and the lack of armor. They discovered its strengths, but also important weaknesses. It couldn't dive at high speed, and one bullet to the fuel tank could set it on fire. Grumman's team used this knowledge to shape their new fighter. They called it the F6F, later known as the Hellcat. From the beginning, the Hellcat was built differently from Japanese aircraft. It wasn't elegant or light. It was tough. Grumman engineers believed every American pilot deserved a chance to come home alive. So they gave the Hellcat armored plates around the cockpit, bulletproof glass, and self-sealing fuel tanks. This made it heavier than the Zero, but it also made it far more survivable. At the heart of the Hellcat was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, producing over 2,000 horsepower. This gave it incredible speed and climbing power. The aircraft could reach speeds of almost 380 miles per hour and still carry 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, enough firepower to shred a bomber or a fighter in seconds. The U.S. Navy tested the first prototype, the XF6F1, in June 1942. But Navy pilots wanted more speed. So Grumman didn't hesitate. They immediately replaced its engine with a more powerful version, the R2800-10. The new prototype, XF6F3, flew just weeks later. From that moment, the Hellcat was no longer just an idea. It was a weapon. By August 1942, while the battles of Guadalcanal were raging, Hellcats rolled onto production lines. Workers, many of them women, riveted metal, installed engines, and painted the dark blue wings late into the night. America wasn't just responding with words, it was responding with steel. In January 1943, the first Hellcat squadrons arrived at naval bases. Pilot reactions were immediate. They loved it. Commander Jimmy Thatch, who had developed the Thatch Weave tactic to fight Zeros, flew the Hellcat and said, "This is the fighter we've been waiting for. It climbed better than the Wildcat, dove faster than the Zero, and could take hits that would destroy any Japanese plane." But building a fighter was only half the battle. The U.S. also needed pilots ready to use it. Training programs changed overnight. Pilots practiced high-speed dives, gunnery accuracy, and how to use the Hellcat's strength instead of copying Japanese dogfighting styles. Instructors reminded them, "You don't turn with a Zero, you climb above it, dive through it, and fire once. Make it count." Japan did not know what was coming. They believed America would take years to catch up. But less than 18 months after Pearl Harbor, the Hellcat was already on aircraft carriers like the USS Essex and USS Yorktown, ready for combat. By mid-1943, the Hellcat flew its first mission in the Pacific. It was faster, tougher, and more powerful than any fighter Japan had seen. Pilots who once feared the Zero now felt something new: confidence. America had answered Japan's challenge. The age of fear was ending. The age of the Hellcat was about to begin. The first time Japanese pilots encountered the F6F Hellcat, they didn't know what it was. At first glance, it looked like another American Wildcat. Slow, clumsy, and easy to bring down. But when they attacked, something was different. The American plane didn't fall, kept climbing, kept fighting, could take bullets and still stay in the air. This was not the Wildcat they knew. This was something new, something terrifying. Early 1943. The Pacific War had entered a new phase. Japan was stretched thin across thousands of miles of ocean. Its pilots were still some of the most skilled in the world, but many of the veterans who fought at Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and Midway had been lost. Their replacements, young, brave, but far less trained, were being rushed into combat. They expected to face the same old American planes. But the United States had sent something different: the F6F Hellcat. The first confirmed combat use of the Hellcat came in August 1943 during operations in the Pacific island of Marcus, Minami Torishima. Shortly after, larger battles followed in the Solomon Islands and over the skies of Rabaul in November 1943. It was over Rabaul, Japan's fortress in the South Pacific, where Japanese pilots truly felt the shock. Japanese ace Saburo Sakai, one of the most respected Zero pilots, described his first encounter. When he fired at an American fighter, expecting it to explode as usual, the enemy aircraft simply kept flying. Smoke trailed from its engine, but it refused to fall. Sakai reportedly said, "This was no ordinary Grumman. It was something stronger." Radio intercepts from Japanese squadrons began mentioning a new, powerful American fighter, faster in dives, harder to hit, and deadly in its attacks. The Hellcat's first major test came during the raid on Rabaul on November 5, 1943. Dozens of Hellcats from USS Essex and USS Bunker Hill escorted American dive bombers and torpedo planes. Japanese Zeros rose to meet them. What happened next stunned the Japanese command. The Hellcat pilots shot down more than 20 enemy aircraft with almost no losses. U.S. pilot Lieutenant Hugh O'Neill said, "They came at us like they always did, but this time we weren't afraid." In fierce dogfights, Japanese pilots tried their familiar tactics: sharp turns, vertical climbs, feints, and dives. But unlike the Wildcat, the Hellcat could match their speed in a dive and even climb with them. And when bullets struck the American plane, it didn't burst into flames. Its armor protected the pilot, and its self-sealing fuel tanks stopped leaks. Japanese pilots soon reported that the new American fighter could take 5 to 10 times more damage than a Zero and still fly. More frightening was the firepower. The Hellcat carried 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, each capable of firing 800 rounds per minute. A 1-second burst could tear off a Zero's wing or destroy its engine. Veteran Japanese pilot Tetsuzo Iwamoto noted in his diary, "The new Grumman's bullets are like thunder. If they touch you, your aircraft disintegrates." By early 1944, stories of the Hellcat spread through Japanese air bases in Truk, Saipan, and Iwo Jima. Rumors called it the Grumman Demon or Hellcato, a name spoken with a mix of respect and fear. Pilots were advised not to dogfight it. Instead, they were told to attack from above, then dive away. But even this became dangerous. The Hellcat could dive faster and follow them down. One of the most symbolic encounters occurred when Japanese ace Hiroyoshi Nishizawa engaged a group of Hellcats near Bougainville. Nishizawa, often called the Devil of Rabaul, shot down many American planes in earlier battles. But this time the fight was different. He managed to damage a Hellcat, but before he could finish it, another Hellcat appeared behind him. He escaped, but later admitted, "They are not the same Americans we fought in 1942. Radio messages intercepted by U.S. intelligence revealed growing anxiety in Japanese ranks. One frustrated pilot broadcast, "These new American fighters, they keep coming. We fire, but they do not fall." Another message warned, "Do not underestimate the new Grumman. It is strong. It is deadly." American pilots, once terrified of the Zero, now entered battles with confidence. Pilot James "Jimmy" Thatch, who helped create tactics to counter the Zero, wrote after flying the Hellcat in combat, "At last, we have the plane we need." Still, Japanese pilots remained skilled and dangerous. In many battles, they managed to down Hellcats with precision shots or daring maneuvers. But each lost Zero was harder to replace. America could build hundreds of Hellcats in a month. Japan could not replace its pilots, fuel, or aircraft at the same speed. By the end of 1943, one truth was clear. The skies were changing. The Zero was no longer untouchable. The Hellcat wasn't just another fighter. It was a warning that Japan's air dominance was ending. For the first time since the war began, American pilots believed they could win. And for the first time, Japanese pilots felt something they had never known in the sky: fear. The battle between the American F6F Hellcat and the Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0 was not just a clash of machines. It was a fight between two philosophies of war. On one side stood the Zero, light, fast, and incredibly agile, built for offense, not survival. On the other side emerged the Hellcat, heavier, armored, and brutally powerful, designed to win and to bring its pilot home alive. When pilots first compared the two fighters, it was clear the Zero could outturn almost any aircraft in the sky. It was elegant, weighing little more than an empty fuel tank. It had thin wings, no cockpit armor, and no self-sealing fuel tanks. This made it deadly in skilled hands, but also fragile. A single bullet could ignite the Zero like a torch. The Hellcat was the opposite. Grumman engineers built it with one goal: overpower the Zero. It carried thick armor around the cockpit, bulletproof glass in the front, and a rugged airframe that could absorb heavy fire. Pilots called it the Grumman Iron Works for a reason. Even if its wings were shredded or its engine leaking oil, a Hellcat could still fly, fight, and land safely. The difference became clear in combat. The Zero's greatest strength was maneuverability. In a slow-speed turning fight, the Hellcat couldn't match it. But American pilots knew this. They were trained never to turn with a Zero. Instead, they used speed, altitude, and diving attacks. The Hellcat's powerful Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine gave it over 2,000 horsepower, almost twice the power of the Zero. While a Zero climbed gracefully, the Hellcat climbed like a rocket. In a dive, the difference was even more dramatic. The Zero's lightweight wings could not handle high-speed dives. They shook violently, sometimes even tearing apart. The Hellcat, however, was built to dive hard. Pilots used boom and zoom tactics, diving from above, firing a burst of machine guns, then climbing back to safety before the Zeros could turn toward them. Firepower was another decisive advantage. The Zero carried two 7.7mm machine guns and two 20mm cannons. Powerful, but with limited ammunition. The Hellcat carried 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, firing over 4,000 rounds per minute. A single 1-second burst from the Hellcat could rip a Zero's wing clean off. Japanese pilots wrote in their diaries that being hit by a Hellcat felt like being struck by a storm of metal. Survivability also shaped the outcome. When a Zero was hit, the pilot often never stood a chance. There was no armor to protect him, no fire suppression system. Many Japanese pilots died without even knowing they had been shot. In contrast, American pilots survived hits that would have destroyed any Japanese plane. They often returned to their carriers with bullet holes in the wings, oil leaking from the engine, yet still alive. Another factor was endurance. The Zero had impressive range early in the war, one of the reasons it dominated across the Pacific. But by 1943, long-range operations, fuel shortages, and worn-out engines reduced its advantage. The Hellcat, with drop tanks and reliable engines, could escort bombers deep into enemy territory and still return. Tactics evolved too. The Thatch Weave, invented by U.S. Navy pilot Jimmy Thatch, allowed Hellcat pilots to cover each other in combat. When a Zero chased one Hellcat, the other would turn and fire at the attacker. This teamwork neutralized the Zero's dogfighting advantage. Meanwhile, Japanese pilots, trained for individual glory, often fought alone with no radar, no ground control, and no coordinated tactics. By late 1943 and 1944, the results spoke for themselves. In aerial combat, the Hellcat achieved a kill ratio of nearly 19-1 against Japanese aircraft, one of the highest in aviation history. In the Battle of the Philippine Sea alone, Hellcat pilots shot down more than 300 Japanese aircraft in 2 days. The Japanese called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. It wasn't that the Zero had suddenly become weak. It was still deadly in skilled hands. But the war had changed. Japan could no longer replace its veteran pilots. Meanwhile, America produced thousands of new Hellcats and trained pilots faster than ever before. The Hellcat didn't just defeat the Zero, it ended its era. The skies were no longer ruled by lightness and agility, but by power, protection, and precision. This was why the Hellcat dominated. Not because it was perfect, but because it was built to survive, built to adapt, and built to win. By mid-1944, the war in the Pacific had reached a decisive moment. The United States had recovered from the early disasters of Pearl Harbor and the fall of the Philippines. American industry was producing warships, aircraft, and trained pilots at a rate Japan could never match. And now the U.S. Navy was preparing for one of the largest carrier battles of the war, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. It was here that the F6F Hellcat would prove itself beyond any doubt, earning the battle its famous nickname, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The target was the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. Capturing these islands would allow the U.S. to build airfields for the new B-29 Superfortress bombers, putting mainland Japan within direct bombing range. Japan could not allow this to happen. To stop the American invasion fleet, they sent nearly all their remaining aircraft carriers and hundreds of fighters, including their once-feared Mitsubishi A6M0. But things were different now. The Japanese Navy was no longer the elite force it had been in 1941. Many of its best pilots had been lost in earlier battles like Midway, Guadalcanal, and the Solomon Islands. Replacements were poorly trained, rushed through flight schools, and given little combat experience. Their aircraft were still mostly Zeros, fast and agile, but lightly armored and badly outmatched by new American fighters. The Americans, on the other hand, had hundreds of F6F Hellcats on their carriers, flown by well-trained, battle-tested pilots. The Hellcat was faster in a dive, tougher in combat, and carried heavier guns. It had radar support, organized fighter direction centers, and coordinated tactics that allowed it to intercept enemy aircraft long before they reached the fleet. On the morning of June 19, 1944, radar aboard U.S. carriers detected waves of incoming Japanese aircraft launched from distant carriers west of the Marianas. Hellcats were scrambled into the sky in disciplined formations, guided by radio controllers on board the ships. As the first Japanese formations approached, they were shocked to find dozens of Hellcats diving down from above. What followed was not a battle, it was a massacre. Japanese pilots, many inexperienced and flying outdated aircraft, tried to break through the American defenses. But they were intercepted far from the fleet. Hellcat pilots calmly tore into the enemy formations. Their .50 caliber machine guns ripped through Zero wings and fuel tanks. One U.S. pilot described it as like shooting turkeys in a barrel. and the nickname stuck. By the end of the first day, American pilots had shot down over 300 Japanese aircraft, while losing fewer than 30 of their own in combat. Many Japanese planes never even returned to their carriers. They ran out of fuel and crashed into the sea. Others were shot down trying to land. Japanese commanders could only watch in horror as their air power was destroyed in a single day. But the battle wasn't over. On June 20th, American reconnaissance finally located the Japanese carrier fleet. Admiral Mark Mitcher made a daring decision to launch a massive airstrike near sunset, even though it meant pilots would have to return in darkness. Hundreds of Hellcats, Avengers, and dive bombers roared into the twilight sky. They found the Japanese carriers and struck hard. The carrier Hayo was sunk. Others, including Shokaku and Zuikaku, were heavily damaged. When the American pilots returned in the dark, low on fuel, Mitcher ordered the fleet to switch on all its lights, a dangerous but life-saving move. Dozens of pilots were rescued from the ocean that night. The result of the battle was absolute. Japan lost almost all of its remaining trained naval aviators and more than 3 aircraft carriers. The United States now completely dominated the skies over the Pacific. The age of the Zero was over. The Hellcat had become the ruler of the air. From this moment, Japan was no longer fighting to win, it was fighting to survive. War is often described in numbers: planes shot down, ships sunk, victories and defeats. But behind every statistic was a pilot, a human being, sitting alone in a fragile cockpit with life or death only seconds away. In this chapter, we hear the voices of real pilots, American and Japanese, who witnessed the arrival of the Hellcat and the fall of the Zero. One of the most famous American Hellcat pilots was Lieutenant Alex Vreeshuh of VF-16. On June 19, 1944, during the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, he spotted a formation of Japanese dive bombers heading toward the U.S. fleet. With calm precision, he dove in from behind, firing short bursts. "They just kept falling," he later said. In only 8 minutes, Vreeshuh shot down 6 enemy aircraft. He returned to his carrier with only 22 bullets left in his guns. "It was almost too easy," he admitted, but he also respected the bravery of the Japanese pilots who kept flying straight into deadly fire. Another Hellcat pilot, David McCampbell, became the U.S. Navy's top ace. He recalled facing waves of Zeros and Judy dive bombers over the Philippines in late 1944. On one mission, he and his wingman flew alone against more than 30 Japanese planes. Instead of retreating, McCampbell climbed high, then dove like a hawk. He shot down 9 planes in a single mission. "I wasn't thinking about medals," he said. "I was thinking about protecting the boys in the ships below." But not all voices came from victors. Japanese pilot Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's greatest aces, survived dozens of dogfights. By 1943, he saw the difference between old pilots and new recruits. "We were sending boys into the air with only a few hours of training," he wrote. "They flew the legendary Zero, but it no longer ruled the skies." Sakai once faced a Hellcat over the Solomon Islands. He was shocked. It was faster, stronger, and could dive away from danger. This was not the Wildcat we knew. This was something new. Another Japanese pilot, Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda, who helped plan the attack on Pearl Harbor, later admitted that Japan underestimated America's ability to adapt. "We never imagined they would build such a fighter," he said about the Hellcat. "It was like fighting a wall of steel." Hellcat pilots also remembered the emotional side of combat. Ensign Ralph Hanks described his first encounter with a Zero near the Marshall Islands. "I saw him before he saw me," he said. "Training told me what to do: dive, fire, pull up. But when his plane caught fire and went down, I realized someone was inside." Hanks wrote in his journal that night, "Victory felt hollow. War is not glorious. It is survival." Aboard Japanese carriers, the mood was very different from the early years of triumph. Pilot Kiyoshi Kanai, who flew from the carrier Junyo, described the first time he saw Hellcats diving from above during the Marianas battle. "They came from the sun, silent at first," he said. "Then I heard bullets hitting my wings. I pulled the stick, but my Zero wouldn't climb fast enough. I knew, in that moment, the war had changed." Many Japanese pilots also felt guilt. They knew their country was losing. They saw friends crash into the sea with empty fuel tanks or burn in their cockpits. Some returned to their carriers only to find the flight deck in flames. Pilot Tetsuzo Iwamoto, one of Japan's top aces, wrote sadly, "We fought with honor, but honor could not stop the Hellcats." For American pilots, the Hellcat became more than just a machine. It was their armor, their weapon, and sometimes their only friend in the sky. They trusted its rugged frame to bring them home. Pilots often returned with wings full of bullet holes, yet the Hellcat kept flying. Lieutenant Commander John Jimmy Thatch, who created the famous Thatch Weave tactic, said, "The Hellcat gave us confidence. We could fight and we could live." By the end of the war, the voices of the pilots told a clear story. The Hellcat had not just defeated the Zero, it had changed the very nature of air combat in the Pacific. Japanese pilots spoke of courage and tragedy. Americans spoke of duty and survival. But all of them on both sides shared the same sky, the same fear, and the same hope to see home again. By the final year of World War II, the skies over the Pacific had changed forever. The Mitsubishi Zero, once the symbol of Japanese air power and dominance, was no longer feared. Instead, it became a reminder of a time when Japan ruled the skies, a time that had ended with the arrival of the Grumman F6F Hellcat. The Hellcat did not just challenge the Zero. It buried its legacy and reshaped the future of aerial warfare. The Hellcat's impact was staggering. Entering combat in 1943, it achieved an incredible 19-to-1 kill ratio against Japanese aircraft. More than 5,100 enemy planes were destroyed by Hellcat pilots, more than any other Allied fighter in the Pacific War. This was not luck or coincidence. It was the result of superior engineering, advanced tactics, powerful industry, and experienced pilots who learned from the painful early years of the war. The Zero had been designed for long range and agility, but it lacked armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and heavy firepower. It was built for offense, not survival. At the beginning of the war, this gave Japan a deadly advantage. But as time passed, the world changed. The United States studied the Zero, improved its own designs, and built fighters that could not only outfight it but outlast it. The Hellcat represented this evolution. Strong armor protected the pilot. Thick wings and a powerful Pratt and Whitney engine gave it speed, durability, and deadly firepower. American tactics evolved: 2 radar guidance, coordinated fighter direction centers, and team-based combat replaced individual heroism. Japanese pilots soon found themselves facing not just a new airplane, but a new kind of war. By 1944 and 1945, Japan struggled to keep up. It no longer had the trained pilots needed to fly the Zero to its full potential. Inexperienced recruits, rushed into combat, faced seasoned Hellcat veterans. Battles like the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf destroyed what was left of Japan's carrier air power. The Zero, once a symbol of pride, became a desperate tool in suicide missions, the kamikaze attacks. Hellcats played a critical role in defending the fleet from these kamikaze strikes. Their speed and firepower allowed them to intercept suicide planes before they reached American ships. Pilots recalled how they would spot a Zero diving straight toward a battleship or carrier, not to dogfight, but to explode. It was a tragic transformation of an aircraft that had once ruled the skies. When the war ended in August 1945, the Hellcat stood as a symbol of victory. Many were kept in service for years after the war, serving in training roles and even in the early years of the Korean conflict. The Zero, however, faded into history. Only a few remained intact, preserved in museums as relics of a vanished era. But the legacy of the Hellcat was not only about victory. It taught the world key lessons in aerial combat: the importance of pilot protection, teamwork, technology, and industrial strength. It proved that wars are not won only by bravery, but by adaptation and innovation. American engineers, mechanics, and factory workers, far from the battlefield, were just as responsible for its success as the pilots who flew it. For Japan, the end of the Zero era marked the end of an age of military expansion. After the war, it shifted toward peace, technology, and economic growth. Some former Zero and Hellcat pilots would later meet in peace ceremonies and air shows. They shook hands as old warriors, not enemies. Many said the same thing: "We survived, that was our greatest victory." Today, the Hellcat and the Zero are remembered side by side in museums, documentaries, and restored aircraft that still fly in the skies. One represents the rise and fall of Japan's early war dominance. The other represents America's response. Powerful, relentless, and destined to change the course of the war. The Hellcat did more than defeat the Zero. It closed a chapter in history. It marked the end of the age of the Zero and the beginning of a new era of air superiority. One built on strength, resilience, and the unbreakable will to adapt and overcome.